Once upon a time, Nissan added a letter to its sports car nameplate and created the Fairlady Z. And it chose the last letter of the alphabet because it represented the end, the last word, the ultimate. And the Datsun 240Z, as it was sold here, was indeed the last word in sports cars. It created a legend, not just for Nissan, but for an entire country. Because the 240Z was the car that made Americans stop looking at Japanese cars as curiosities and start buying them. And the joke of that whole thing is the 240Z we got isn't even close to being the ultimate Z. This one is. First things first, let's talk about the name Datsun. The Z, like all Nissan products of the time, was sold in America under the name Datsun. That name actually came before Nissan. The whole company was founded in 1911 as the Kaishinsha Motorcar Works, but was renamed DAT to honor its three financial backers. Dat in Japanese would be pronounced datto, which means with the swiftness of a hare in flight, which is not bad imagery for a car company. In 1931, so 20 years later, the company was taken over and reorganized. Its name was turned into DATSON, S-O-N, meaning the son of Dot. Also not a bad image, except that in Japanese, S-O-N, son, can be taken to mean a loss. And so when the DATSON works were flooded by a typhoon, well, they took that to be a bad omen. And so they changed the O to a U, thus removing the curse and replacing it with the sun, which is an important image in Japanese culture. The sun didn't help this time because 2 years later, in 1934, the company was reorganized again, and its new owner changed the name to Nissan, which was the first few letters of his first and last names. Cars sold in America kept the Datsun name out of pride and trepidation. They didn't want to tarnish the Nissan name in case the company didn't succeed here. That decision was reversed in 1982, and it created a huge amount of confusion, with people worrying that Datsun was going out of business. I remember I was there. We thought, who is this Nissan person, and what are they going to do with our beloved Datsun? Well, Datsun was beloved because of the Z. But before the Z, there was Nissan's little, British-type Roadster. This era's stereotype of Japanese companies being copycats of the West wasn't really all that unfounded. 1950s Nissan spent most of its time building modified Austins. So it's really no surprise that Datsun's first sports car of note was heavily influenced by British roadsters. Known here as the Datsun 2000 Roadster in its final 2-liter form, it was called the Fairlady in Japan, named after the Broadway play. When the time came to replace the Fairlady, the emphasis was on selling it in America. Unfortunately, most everyone was convinced that the US government would outlaw convertibles with strict safety regulations. This is, by the way, why the Porsche Targa exists. Porsche did that in the hopes that it would pass the rollover tests that convertibles wouldn't. Nissan's solution was to turn the Fairlady from a 2-seat Roadster into a 2-seat coupe. And in the early 1960s, at the behest of its financing bank, Nissan worked together with Yamaha on a sports car project, culminating in a prototype called the A550X. It contained a 2-liter twin-cam 4-cylinder that Yamaha had designed based on an experimental American aero engine, 4-wheel disc brakes, retractable headlights, and a monocoque body with separate subframes. Ultimately, Nissan wasn't impressed, so it killed the relationship with Yamaha. It shelved the whole Fairlady project and abandoned the entire idea of a closed sports car. However, in 1965, that Yamaha project reappeared in heavily modified form as the panty-dropping Toyota 2000 GT, which ironically was then turned into a convertible in the James Bond movie You Only Live Twice.
Get in, quick!
The public's reaction was so positive that Nissan dusted off its old plans and went back to work on a new Fairlady, the Fairlady Z.
The Z was a very simple recipe. It took the Datsun 510's front McPherson strut suspension and married it to a new Chapman strut independent rear. With rack and pinion steering and disc front brakes, this was serious stuff for the late 1960s. The engine was a Mercedes-Benz straight 6.
That was not actually a Mercedes-Benz straight 6. See, as all of this was happening, Nissan merged with Prince, who was a high-end Japanese car maker. Prince was in trouble, and the Japanese government suggested the two companies work together. Prince had a license to manufacture 1950s-era Mercedes single overhead camshaft engines, and Nissan inherited that license when it bought Prince. That is how the Datsun 510's four-cylinder came to be. It started out as a Mercedes-Benz straight six. They lopped off two cylinders, made a bunch of changes, and voila. To make a six-cylinder for the Z, well, they added two cylinders back on there, creating a straight six engine that came from Mercedes-Benz but was not a Mercedes-Benz straight six.
When you look at the Z, think about what other cars looked like at the end of the 1960s, and you'll understand why this thing made the world stop and stare. Period road tests continually dropped mentions of the F word.
Ferrari. Indeed, it looked like the most beautiful and expensive cars you could buy, Ferraris and Jaguar E-types, but it was built better than any of them. Here's a quote that I love. "You could be messing around for ages trying to get an early Jaguar door right, and then you'd have to adjust it again once all the electrics went in. The Japanese could throw a door from 10 yards, and it would fit." Who throws a door?
A lusty straight six, great chassis, gorgeous looks, and good build quality. So of course the thing was a sensation. And that created one of the biggest parts of the Z car's history. Everybody on their father tried to take credit for its design, including and especially one German count who was especially talented at self-promotion. He was named
Albrecht Graf von Schlitz, genannt von Goertz und von Friesberg, otherwise known as Albrecht Goertz. Leave it to the Western aristocrat to try to take credit for the entire car, and leave it to the respectful Japanese to shyly not contradict him. But the controversy went so far as to have him threaten to sue Nissan to give him credit for the entire car's design, something that the Nissan president at the time thought was unthinkable.
Fact is, it sure seems like Goertz had effectively nothing to do with the styling of this car. He was hired by Nissan as a consultant early on in the original Fairlady project, and he might have helped push through the idea of making a 911-sized two-seater coupe large enough to comfortably fit two Americans.
Hey, you American? Yeah. Do you fit? Yeah. But are you comfortable? You writing a book? It worked. The design was done in-house at Nissan, and today there are dozens of pages of internet forum arguments between Z-car experts discussing who did what, when, how, and for whom. And what that tells me is this incredible piece of art was done by a team of people who shared one collective vision, all of whom were employed by Nissan, and none of whom were named Albrecht Graf von Schlitz, genannt von Goertz und von Friesberg.
Anyway, the comparisons to Ferraris and Jags didn't stop with the styling. Independent suspension, rear drive, and 151 horsepower from a straight six that sounded so good, it fooled more than one journalist into thinking it was a Ferrari V12. The thing hauled ass. 0 to 60 in under 8 seconds, quarter mile in 16, and over 120 miles an hour if you kept your foot in it. It was a giant beater. You could get similar acceleration from a Porsche 911 or a Ferrari 246 Dino, but you'd have to add a 1 to the beginning of the 240Z's price tag to buy that Ferrari. The Z was dirt cheap, $3,500, when a Corvette was $5,500 or a 911 was $6,000.
The new Datsun should be a true touring GT car for the young fellow who never had a sports car, but wanted a Porsche or Healey as he was going through college. When he goes to see what a Porsche sells for and falls over at the price, he comes back to reality and buys a Datsun.
And that's exactly what happened. Everybody bought a Datsun. The 240Z sold like the dickens with wait lists for years. It took Chevrolet 25 years to sell 500,000 Corvettes. Datsun sold that many Zs in less than 10.
The only Z that didn't sell well was this one. This is a Japanese market only Fairlady Z432. And had Nissan been able to sell just 12 more of them, 432 could have stood for how many they sold. But they couldn't, and so it doesn't. And they didn't.
In fact, 432 stood for 4 valves per cylinder, 3 carburetors, and 2 camshafts. This is the S20, Japan's first mass-produced 4-valve engine, and despite its truly pornographic exterior proportions, its 6 pistons displace only 2 liters.
And it made 160 horsepower by revving to 7,500 RPM. This was race car stuff, because this was a race car motor. Remember that company called Prince that Nissan absorbed in 1966? Well, Prince made a car called the Skyline, and Prince made a race car called the R380.
When the R380's racing engine went into the Skyline coupe, it created the Skyline GTR. And when that same GTR engine went into the Fairlady, it created the Z432. And it did 131 miles an hour, so fast that Japanese police use them for high-speed pursuits. And it makes such an amazing noise that they probably didn't even need a siren to get everyone's attention. This is possibly the best-sounding 6-cylinder engine ever made.
Okay, so it did cost twice as much as the base Z, so no one could afford it other than the police. But still, the 12-valve 2.4-liter that came here was enough to win the 1971 Car and Driver Car of the Year award. And a year later, Road and Track found that 91% of 240Z buyers would buy another one. This car was engineered specifically for the US market, unlike, say, the British Roadsters. And so the Datsun 240Z killed off the British Roadsters. It outsold the similarly priced 6-cylinder MG by a factor of 17.
The 240Z was eventually replaced by the 260Z and then the 280Z, which carried bumps and displacement that weren't quite big enough to counter the power loss from 1970s emission systems. In 1979, an all-new 280ZX debuted, which was less a sports car and more a GT. And that's when the Z really kind of started to slip away.
This was not helped by Datsun becoming Nissan, and everyone becoming confused about who made the Z. And even today, people are still arguing about who designed the Z. But one thing is for certain, Z marks the spot where the student who had been making Mercedes motors and building Austin bodies surpassed its teacher to become a master itself. Okay, so you're just gonna keep the Ferrari framed out the entire time, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Action.
I'm not some rich YouTuber asking you to like and subscribe. Hey, up, keep the Ferrari out. I'm an automotive journalist asking you to like and subscribe. And that's because that's how YouTube works. If you don't click those buttons, YouTube doesn't know you liked what you've just seen and isn't gonna show you any more of it. And if you don't like what you've just seen, well, join the club. And by that, I mean the Hagerty Drivers Club, which gets you access to this award-winning magazine, as well as discounts on amazing stuff. And if you still don't like what you've seen, well, then just leave a nasty comment, because that's how the internet works. I need to go clean that up.